The gunshot cracked through the night, before Nora Bellamy even finished unpacking her single suitcase. She dropped to the floor of the small staff room, heart slamming against her ribs, and pressed her palm flat against the cold wood beneath her. For a moment, she thought she had imagined it. Then came the shouting outside, muffled through thick glass windows, and the sound of heavy boots running across gravel. She had been in this house for exactly 6 hours, and already she understood that nothing about it was ordinary. Nora had taken the job out of desperation, not curiosity. The pay was generous, almost suspiciously so, and the agency that placed her had asked no questions about her past. She needed that. She needed a place where nobody looked too closely at her file, at the gaps in her work history, at the reasons she had left her last town without a proper goodbye. The Voss estate, sitting behind iron gates on the edge of the city, seemed like exactly that kind of place. Quiet on the surface, careful not to ask. She rose slowly and moved to the window, keeping herself out of the direct light. Below, in the wide courtyard lit by security lamps, she saw men in dark coats moving with purpose, one of them barking orders into a radio. At the center of it all stood a tall man in a charcoal suit, unbothered by the chaos around him, as though gunfire near his own home was simply an inconvenience rather than a threat. Even from a distance, Nora could tell this man was in charge. His posture said it before anyone spoke his name. That man was Damien Voss. She would learn his name properly the next morning, when the head housekeeper, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret, gathered the new staff in the kitchen and explained the rules of the house, in a voice that left no room for questions. "You do not speak to Mr. Voss unless he speaks to you first," Margaret said, arranging cups on a tray with brisk, practiced hands. "You do not ask about his business. You do not ask about last night. If you hear anything, you did not hear it. If you see anything, you did not see it. Do you understand?" The other new hire, a nervous young man named Colin, who had been placed as a driver's assistant, nodded quickly. Nora nodded too, though her mind was still turning over the memory of the gunshot, the shouting, the calm way Damien Voss had stood in the middle of it all. "Good," Margaret said. "Now get to work. The maid before you left in a hurry, so the West Wing is behind. Nora, you'll start there." Nora spent the morning scrubbing floors that did not need much scrubbing, and dusting shelves lined with books she suspected nobody in the house had ever read. The West Wing was grand in a cold way, all dark wood and expensive silence, the kind of beauty that made a person feel like an intruder rather than a guest. She kept her head down, her movements small and efficient, the way she had trained herself to move in places where drawing attention was dangerous. She was reorganizing a shelf of ledgers in the study when the door opened without warning. Damien Voss stepped inside, phone pressed to his ear, speaking in short, clipped sentences to someone about a shipment delay. He barely glanced at her, waving one hand dismissively toward the door, as if she were a piece of furniture blocking his path. Nora shifted quickly out of his way, but her elbow caught the edge of a stack of folders on the desk, sending them sliding to the floor with a soft slap of paper against wood. Damien ended his call and looked down at the mess, then up at her, his expression unreadable. "Careful," he said, his voice flat, almost bored. "I don't need clumsy hands in this room." "I'm sorry, sir," Nora said quietly, already crouching to gather the papers. He watched her for a moment longer, the kind of look that measured and dismissed in the same breath, then walked past her without another word, leaving the scent of expensive cologne and something colder behind him. Nora knelt there for a few seconds after he left, staring at the closed door, feeling the familiar sting of being seen and found wanting all at once. She had felt that sting before, in another house, with another man who thought his opinion of her was the only one that mattered. She pushed the memory down before it could rise any further, and finished stacking the folders in careful, even piles. By the end of her first week, Nora understood the shape of the household well enough. Damien Voss ran something large and dangerous from behind the walls of his mansion, something involving shipments and warehouses, and men who came and went at strange hours, with tension written across their faces. The staff spoke of him in careful whispers, always with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. He was known for being exact, for noticing details others missed, for punishing carelessness swiftly and without warmth. He was also known, according to Margaret's quiet asides in the kitchen, for going through maids quickly. Not because of any scandal, but because his standards were impossible to meet, and his patience for imperfection was thin as paper. Nora had no intention of leaving. She needed the money too badly, and more than that, she needed the stability, the routine, the sense that if she simply did her job well, and stayed invisible, nothing bad would find her here. She threw herself into her work with a discipline that surprised even her, rising before dawn, memorizing the layout of every room, learning which floorboards creaked and which curtains needed to be drawn at exactly which hour. Damien, for his part, seemed to take almost no notice of her at all, except when something went wrong. It happened on a Thursday evening, nearly 2 weeks into her employment. Nora had been asked to prepare a tray of refreshments for a meeting in the private dining room, where Damien sat with 3 men Nora did not recognize, their voices low and tense around a long table. As she set down the tray, one of the men shifted suddenly, his arm knocking against a lit candle, sending a small curl of flame licking up the edge of a folded napkin. The men startled back from the table, one of them cursing loudly, but Nora moved without thinking. She grabbed a pitcher of water from the tray and doused the flame in a single smooth motion, then pressed her palm flat against the scorched napkin to make sure no ember remained. The whole moment lasted less than 5 seconds. When it was over, the room was silent, 4 men staring at her with varying degrees of surprise. Damien's eyes lingered on her the longest. "That's efficient," one of the men said, half laughing, breaking the tension. "Faster than my own security." Damien said nothing. He simply watched Nora gather the ruined napkin and the empty pitcher, her hands steady despite the eyes on her, and something in his gaze shifted, just slightly, from indifference to a faint, reluctant curiosity. It was gone by the time she left the room, replaced by his usual cool detachment, but Nora felt it all the same, like a held breath finally released. She did not think much of it. A single moment of quick thinking did not undo weeks of being overlooked, of being spoken to, as though she were slow or fragile, simply because of how she looked, or how quietly she moved through the world. She had grown used to being underestimated. In some strange way she had learned to use it, to let people's low expectations become a kind of shield. But the household began to shift around her in small ways after that night. One of the senior guards, a broad-shouldered man named Gareth, started nodding to her in the hallways, instead of ignoring her. Margaret assigned her more responsibility, trusting her with rooms closer to Damien's private wing. And Damien himself, though he still spoke to her rarely, began to look at her a beat longer than necessary when their paths crossed, as though trying to solve a puzzle he could not quite name. Nora told herself it meant nothing. She had learned the hard way that being noticed by powerful men rarely ended well for women like her. Better to stay useful, stay quiet, stay unseen except in the ways that kept her employed. It was nearly 3 weeks into her time at the estate when she first heard the phone call that would change everything. She had been sent to collect linens from a hallway closet near Damien's study late at night, long after most of the staff had gone to their quarters. The door to the study was slightly open, a sliver of golden light spilling into the dark corridor, and Damien's voice carried out into the hallway, low and controlled, but edged with something Nora had not heard from him before: tension, maybe even the faintest trace of unease. "I don't care what Victor thinks he can prove," Damien was saying. "He's been sniffing around my shipments for months. If he wants a war, I'll give him one. But not yet. Not until I know who's talking to him from inside my own house." Nora froze in the hallway, the stack of linens pressed against her chest, her pulse loud in her own ears. She should have kept walking. She should have pretended she heard nothing, exactly as Margaret had instructed on her very first day. Instead, she stood there a moment too long, absorbing the shape of the threat hiding beneath the surface of this cold, beautiful house. Someone inside this house was betraying Damien Voss, and somewhere out there, a man named Victor Kane was waiting for the right moment to strike. A floorboard shifted under her foot, the smallest creak, but in the silence of the corridor it sounded like a gunshot all over again. The study door swung open fully, and Damien stood there, phone still in hand, his eyes narrowing as they landed on her. "What are you doing out here?" he said. Not quite a question, more an accusation dressed as one. Collecting linens, sir, Nora said, keeping her voice even, holding up the folded stack as proof, though her heart was hammering hard enough that she was certain he could hear it. I didn't mean to disturb you. He studied her for a long moment, the same measuring look he always gave her, but sharper now, edged with suspicion. Nora held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to give him any reason to think she had something to hide, even though she had just heard something she was fairly certain she was never meant to hear. Go to bed, he said finally, his voice cooling back into its usual flatness. Early morning tomorrow. Yes, sir, Nora said, and walked past him without another word, forcing her steps to stay slow and unhurried, even as every nerve in her body screamed at her to run. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake in her narrow staff bed, staring at the ceiling, turning the overheard words over and over in her mind. A traitor inside the house, a rival named Victor Kane building toward something, and a boss who dismissed her as clumsy, unremarkable, barely worth a second glance, standing directly in the path of whatever was coming. Nora had come to this house looking for safety, for a quiet place to disappear into routine and invisibility. Instead, she had walked straight into the middle of a war she did not yet understand, in a house full of secrets, guarded by a man who had no idea how much danger was already circling closer than he thought. She closed her eyes at last, not with peace, but with a strange, unfamiliar resolve settling low in her chest. Whatever was coming, she was already tangled in it now. There was no walking back out through those iron gates and pretending she had heard nothing. The next morning, she rose before dawn as always, dressed in her plain gray uniform, and made her way down to the kitchen to begin her duties, carrying the weight of what she knew like a stone, tucked carefully beneath her ribs, hidden from everyone, including the man who least expected how much she might one day matter to his survival. A black car idled outside the gates at 2 a.m, its headlights off, its engine humming low in the darkness, and Nora saw it from her window before anyone else in the house did. She had taken to waking at strange hours since the night she overheard Damien's phone call, her body unable to settle into deep sleep, even when exhaustion pulled at her limbs. Something in her stayed alert now, the way it had years ago, back when she first learned that safety was never something to be taken for granted. She sat up in bed, watching the car through the gap in her curtains, counting the seconds it stayed motionless at the gate, before finally pulling away into the night. She almost convinced herself it was nothing, a lost driver, a curious neighbor, but her instincts, sharpened by a past she rarely let herself think about, told her otherwise. In the days that followed, Nora threw herself deeper into her work, partly to prove her worth, and partly to keep her mind from circling endlessly around the danger she now knew was creeping toward the estate. She learned the rhythms of the house better than anyone, better even than staff who had worked there for years. She knew which guards patrolled which corners at which hours, which doors were left unlocked out of habit, which windows offered a clear line of sight to the driveway below. Damien, meanwhile, continued to treat her with the same detached indifference as always, though Nora began to notice small inconsistencies in his coldness. He would pause sometimes when she entered a room, his gaze lingering half a second too long before he caught himself and looked away. He corrected one of his men sharply for speaking rudely to her in the hallway, though he never acknowledged the moment to Nora directly. It was as if some part of him had started paying attention without his permission. She told herself it did not matter. Men like Damien Voss did not change their opinions of people like her, simply because of a doused candle and a few quiet observations. She had learned long ago not to build hope on such thin foundations. The real test came on a warm evening nearly a week later, when Damien hosted a gathering of his closest associates in the main hall, a rare event that required nearly the entire household staff to be present and working. Nora was assigned to the kitchen, preparing trays alongside 2 other women, while the sounds of tense laughter and clinking glasses drifted in from the hall beyond. She was carrying a tray of drinks through the corridor when she noticed one of the guests, a broad-shouldered man with a scar along his jaw, moving in the wrong direction, away from the main hall and toward the private wing, where Damien kept his office and personal quarters. Every member of staff knew the boundary instinctively, drilled into them from their very first day. She set the tray down quietly on a side table and followed at a careful distance, staying close to the wall, her footsteps silent against the thick carpet. The man reached Damien's office door and tried the handle, finding it locked. He glanced around, clearly checking whether anyone had seen him, before producing a small tool from his jacket pocket and crouching to work at the lock. Nora's heart pounded, but her mind stayed strangely clear, the way it always did in moments that demanded quick thinking rather than fear. She could call for a guard, but by the time help arrived, the man might already be inside, might already have what he came for, whatever that was. She thought of the phone call she had overheard, the mention of a traitor inside the house, and wondered if this was the answer walking right in front of her. "Can I help you find something?" she said, stepping out from the shadows, her voice calm and pleasant, the voice of a maid offering polite assistance, rather than a woman who had just caught an intruder in the act. The man startled, straightening quickly, his hand slipping the tool back into his jacket. "Wrong turn," he said, forcing a smile, "looking for the washroom." "Of course," Nora said, matching his smile with one of her own. "It's just this way. Let me show you." She led him back down the corridor, chatting lightly about the party, about the weather, about nothing at all, while her mind raced through what she had just seen. The moment they reached the main hall again, she excused herself and found Gareth near the entrance, keeping her voice low as she described what had happened. Gareth's expression hardened immediately. "You're sure about the lock?" "I saw the tool in his hand," Nora said. "He was working the door when I found him." Gareth disappeared to alert the other guards, and within minutes, the broad-shouldered man was quietly escorted from the party, under the pretense of a private conversation, never allowing the other guests to sense that anything unusual had occurred. Nora returned to the kitchen and finished her work as though nothing had happened, though her hands trembled faintly as she stacked the last of the empty glasses. She did not expect Damien to say anything to her about it. She assumed the matter would pass through Gareth and the senior staff, filed away as another piece of the ongoing conflict simmering beneath the surface of the house, entirely separate from her small, insignificant role within it. She was wrong. Late that night, long after the guests had gone and the house had settled into its usual heavy silence, Damien found her in the small linen room off the east corridor, folding towels by the dim glow of a single lamp. He stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking, his presence filling the small space in a way that made her fold the towel in her hands more carefully than necessary. "Gareth tells me you caught someone trying to break into my office tonight," he said. Nora set the towel down, straightening to face him properly. "I saw him heading toward the private wing. It didn't seem right, so I followed. And instead of screaming or running, you distracted him and reported it calmly." Damien's tone was measured, difficult to read. Most people would have panicked. "I've learned that panicking rarely helps," Nora said simply, though the words carried more weight than she intended to reveal. Damien studied her for a long moment, his sharp eyes moving over her face as though searching for something hidden beneath the surface. "You're not what I expected when you first walked into this house," he said finally. "I get that a lot," Nora said, a faint, tired edge creeping into her voice before she could stop it. Something flickered across his expression, something almost like understanding, though it vanished as quickly as it appeared. "The man you caught tonight works for someone I have a great deal of history with," Damien said. "His presence here was not an accident. I want you to tell me exactly what he said, exactly how he moved, everything you remember." Nora recounted the encounter in careful detail, and Damien listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening at certain points, his eyes narrowing at others. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring at some fixed point on the wall, as though working through a puzzle only he could see. "Victor Kane," he said at last, more to himself than to her. "He's getting bolder." Nora said nothing, though the name confirmed what she had already suspected since the night she overheard Damien's phone call. She watched him carefully, this man who ran his household with such rigid control, and saw for the first time a flicker of something that looked almost like vulnerability, quickly buried beneath his usual composure. "You should be more careful," Damien said suddenly, his tone shifting back toward its familiar coldness, as though he regretted revealing even that small crack. "Following armed men into empty corridors isn't part of your job." "I wasn't going to let him walk into your office," Nora said before she could stop herself. Damien's eyes met hers, something unreadable passing between them in the quiet of the small linen room. "Why not?" he asked, and for once, the question sounded genuinely curious rather than dismissive. Nora hesitated, unsure how to answer honestly without revealing more of herself than she was ready to share. "Because it was the right thing to do," she said finally. "That's all." He held her gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, sharp and final, before turning to leave. At the doorway he paused. "Thank you," he said, the words clearly unfamiliar in his mouth, stiff and awkward, as though he rarely had cause to use them. Then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the corridor, leaving Nora alone with the towels and the lamp, and the strange, unsettled feeling blooming quietly in her chest. She did not know what to make of the exchange. She told herself it changed nothing, that a single moment of gratitude from a dangerous man did not erase weeks of being dismissed and overlooked. But some small, cautious part of her allowed itself to wonder, just slightly, whether Damien Voss was beginning to see her differently. 2 nights later, Nora was crossing the garden path toward the staff quarters when she noticed a figure standing just beyond the estate's outer wall, partially hidden by the dark shape of an old oak tree. She slowed her steps, watching as the figure raised something to their eye, a small device that caught a brief glint of moonlight. A camera. She stayed perfectly still, pressed against the shadow of a garden statue, watching as the figure took several photographs of the house before slipping away into the night, moving with the practiced ease of someone who had done this before and would likely do it again. Nora's blood ran cold. Whoever this was, they were not simply curious. They were documenting the estate, mapping its entrances and exits, learning its rhythms, exactly as she herself had done in her first weeks there. This was preparation. This was the quiet, careful groundwork of an attack still to come. She hurried inside, her mind racing, torn between reporting immediately to Gareth or waiting until morning to speak with Damien directly. In the end, she chose to write down everything she had seen in careful detail: the time, the location, the direction the figure had come from and gone, tucking the note into her apron pocket to deliver first thing in the morning. She lay awake long after, staring at the ceiling of her small room, listening to the distant, familiar sounds of the estate settling into silence around her. Somewhere out there, Victor Kane was building towards something, patient and methodical, closing in on a man who still had no idea just how close the danger had already come, or how much the quiet, overlooked maid folding his towels might one day stand between him and disaster. Glass shattered somewhere on the ground floor, and Nora was awake and moving before the sound had even finished echoing through the halls. She had delivered her note about the figure with the camera to Gareth 2 mornings earlier, watching him read it with a grim expression, before folding it carefully into his pocket and promising to increase patrols along the outer wall. She had assumed that would be the end of it, that the extra guards and tightened schedules would be enough to discourage whoever had been watching the house. She had been wrong. She pulled a robe over her nightclothes and stepped into the corridor, where other staff members were already emerging from their rooms in various states of alarm, whispered questions passing between them in the dark. Somewhere below she heard shouting, the heavy thud of running footsteps, another crash of something breaking. "Stay here," Margaret ordered the gathered staff, her voice sharp despite the fear flickering in her eyes. "Everyone stay together until we know what's happening." But Nora was already moving toward the stairwell, some instinct pulling her forward rather than back, the same instinct that had once saved her own life in circumstances she rarely allowed herself to remember. She knew this house now, every hallway and shortcut, every place a person might hide or run. If something was happening near Damien's private wing, she could reach it faster than the guards stationed at the far end of the estate. She reached the bottom of the servants' stairwell, just as a figure in dark clothing burst through a side door near the study, moving fast, moving with purpose, straight toward the hallway that led to Damien's private quarters. Nora froze for half a second, every instinct screaming at her to retreat, to find a guard, to let someone else handle this. But there was no time. The intruder was already halfway down the hall, and somewhere beyond that hallway, Damien was likely asleep, unaware and unprotected. She grabbed the heavy iron doorstop from beside the stairwell door, the only object within reach, and stepped directly into the intruder's path. He was larger than her, broader, clearly trained for exactly this kind of confrontation, but Nora had spent years of her life learning how to survive against men who underestimated her size and softness as weakness. She swung the doorstop hard against his wrist as he raised a weapon, knocking it from his grip before he could level it properly, then drove her shoulder into his midsection with every bit of strength she possessed, sending them both crashing against the wall. He recovered quickly, throwing an elbow that caught her along the jaw, pain exploding bright and sharp through her skull. But Nora had trained for pain too, had learned long ago that the fight did not end simply because it hurt. She dropped low, sweeping his legs out from under him with a move she had practiced 100 times in a small gym in another life, and he hit the floor hard, the air driven from his lungs in a single ragged gasp. She did not have time to feel triumphant. Footsteps pounded down the hallway, and she looked up to see 2 more figures rounding the corner, clearly part of the same group, clearly here for the same purpose. Nora? Damien's voice cut through the chaos, and she turned to see him standing at the entrance to his study, fully dressed despite the hour, a firearm already in his hand, his expression a mixture of fury and disbelief as he took in the scene before him, the fallen intruder groaning at Nora's feet, the 2 others skidding to a stop at the sight of him. What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion and noise, Damien's guards finally arriving in force, shouts and struggle filling the hallway, the 2 remaining intruders overwhelmed and subdued within moments, under the combined weight of Damien's trained men. Nora stood frozen against the wall, her jaw throbbing, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline had nowhere left to go, watching as the chaos settled into tense, controlled aftermath. Damien crossed the hallway to her in 3 long strides, his eyes sweeping over her with an intensity she had never seen from him before, checking for injury, for damage, for anything that might explain how she had ended up standing over a subdued attacker in the middle of his private hallway. "What happened?" he demanded, though his voice had lost its usual cold flatness, replaced by something rawer, something closer to genuine concern. "He was heading straight for your study," Nora said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I didn't think, I just moved." Damien's gaze dropped to the doorstop still clutched in her hand, then to the fallen man groaning at her feet, then back to her face, taking in the faint bruise already forming along her jaw. Something shifted in his expression, some final piece of resistance finally giving way. "You fought him off, alone, with a doorstop," he said slowly, as though testing the words, as though they did not quite fit with everything he had believed about her until this moment. "It was the closest thing," Nora said, a faint, exhausted attempt at humor slipping into her voice despite everything. Damien did not smile, but something in his eyes softened, just slightly, just enough for Nora to notice. He turned to Gareth, who had just arrived with 2 more guards in tow. "Get these men secured and separated. I want to know who sent them before sunrise." As the guards dragged the intruders away, Damien remained beside Nora, seemingly unwilling to leave her side, though he said nothing further for a long moment. Finally, he reached out, his fingers brushing lightly, almost hesitantly, against the bruise forming along her jaw. "You should have called for help," he said quietly. "You could have been killed." "So could you," Nora said simply. Damien's hand fell away, and he studied her with an expression she could not quite name, something between disbelief and dawning respect, and a reluctant, unfamiliar warmth he clearly did not know what to do with. "Get some rest," he said finally. "We'll talk in the morning." Nora nodded and turned to go, but his voice stopped her. "Nora." She turned back. "Thank you," he said again, the words still stiff, still unpracticed, but this time carrying a weight that had not been there before. "I mean it." She offered a small, tired smile, and made her way back toward the staff quarters, her body aching, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. She had spent weeks trying to remain invisible in this house, trying to avoid exactly the kind of attention she had just drawn to herself. And yet, standing in that hallway, doorstop in hand, facing down an armed intruder without a second thought, she had felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Not fear, not helplessness, something closer to purpose. The following morning, the entire household buzzed with quiet, disbelieving whispers about what had happened during the night. Margaret pulled Nora aside in the kitchen, her sharp eyes studying her with something like newfound respect. "You could have been killed," she said, echoing Damien's words from the night before. "Whatever possessed you to run toward the danger instead of away from it?" Nora did not have a simple answer, not one she was ready to share. She thought of her own past, the years she had spent learning to defend herself after finally escaping a relationship that had taught her exactly how dangerous it was to be underestimated, how important it was to know how to protect herself when no one else would. She had never expected to use those skills in service of someone else's safety. She had certainly never expected to use them for a man like Damien Voss. She was assigned lighter duties for the day, ostensibly to recover from the bruise along her jaw, though she suspected the real reason was that no one quite knew how to treat her now, how to reconcile the quiet, overlooked maid they had known for weeks with the woman who had single-handedly delayed 3 armed intruders long enough for help to arrive. Damien summoned her to his study in the late afternoon, the same room where she had first dropped his folders weeks earlier, where he had dismissed her so easily as clumsy and unremarkable. He gestured for her to sit, a small courtesy he had never extended before, and studied her for a long moment before speaking. "I had my people look into your background this morning," he said finally, watching her reaction carefully. Nora's stomach tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. "And what did you find?" "Not much," Damien admitted, something almost like frustration crossing his features. "Which is unusual, considering what I watched you do last night. Most people who can fight like that have a history that explains it. Yours is remarkably quiet." "I prefer it that way," Nora said carefully. Damien leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she forced herself to hold his gaze. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," he said finally, surprising her. "But I want you to know that after last night, I see you differently. You're not just staff to me anymore. You're someone I trust to notice things others miss." Nora felt something loosen in her chest, some tension she had been carrying since the very first day she walked through the estate's iron gates. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Damien said, his expression darkening slightly. "Whoever sent those men last night knew exactly where to find my study, exactly which hallway to use, exactly when the guards would be thinnest. That kind of information doesn't come from outside. Someone in this house is still talking to Victor Kane." The weight of his words settled heavily between them, the earlier warmth of the conversation giving way to something colder, sharper, more urgent. Nora thought of the intruder she had caught trying to break into this very office weeks earlier, of the man with the camera, watching from beyond the garden wall, of the careful, patient way Victor Kane seemed to be closing in on Damien from every direction at once. "What do we do?" Nora asked, and she noticed, almost without meaning to, that she had said, "we," as though she were already part of whatever came next. Damien noticed too. Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or something closer to gratitude. "We find out who's talking," he said quietly, "and we find them before Victor gets another chance to finish what he started last night." The dining room had been transformed for the evening, long tables draped in white cloth, candlelight flickering against crystal glasses, and Nora stood near the far wall with a tray balanced against her hip, watching Damien move through the crowd of guests with practiced ease, giving no sign at all of the danger simmering beneath the surface of his composed smile. 3 days had passed since the attack in the private wing, 3 days of quiet, careful investigation that had turned up nothing conclusive about the traitor hiding somewhere among the household staff. Damien had grown more guarded, more watchful, though he continued to seek Nora out in small moments throughout each day, asking her opinion on matters he would never have consulted her about before, trusting her instincts in ways that still felt strange and new to both of them. Tonight's gathering was a business dinner, a meeting between Damien and several associates meant to solidify an important shipping arrangement, the kind of event that required careful staging and absolute control. Nora had helped plan the seating arrangements herself, at Damien's request, using her growing knowledge of the house's layout to ensure clear lines of sight for the guards positioned discreetly around the room. She noticed the man the moment he entered. He arrived late, dressed impeccably, introduced by one of Damien's associates as a new business contact eager to discuss expanding trade routes. He smiled easily, shook hands warmly, complimented the wine and the decor with practiced charm. But Nora, standing near the wall with her tray, noticed the way his eyes moved across the room, cataloging exits, counting guards, lingering just a beat too long on Damien himself. She had seen that kind of gaze before, in the man who had tried the study door, in the figure with the camera beyond the garden wall. This man moved differently, more confidently, more dangerously, but the intent behind his eyes was the same. She caught Gareth's attention from across the room with a small, subtle gesture, tilting her head slightly toward the newcomer. Gareth's eyes narrowed, and he began making his way slowly around the perimeter of the room, closing the distance between himself and the unfamiliar guest, without drawing attention to his approach. Nora continued serving, her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior, watching as the dinner progressed, as toasts were raised and business terms were discussed in low, careful tones. The newcomer remained charming throughout, engaging warmly with the other guests, laughing at the appropriate moments, playing his role with unsettling precision. It was when dessert was served that everything changed. The newcomer rose from his seat, excusing himself politely toward the washroom, and Nora watched him go, every instinct screaming that something was wrong. She set down her tray and followed at a discreet distance, staying close to the wall, her footsteps silent against the thick carpet, exactly as they had been the night she followed the intruder toward Damien's study weeks earlier. Instead of turning toward the washroom, the man moved swiftly down a side corridor, reaching beneath his jacket to produce a small device that Nora recognized immediately from her training years ago. A detonator, small and simple, the kind used to trigger something already planted elsewhere in the house. Her blood went cold. This was not a simple assassination attempt. This was something far larger, something that could bring down the entire estate and everyone inside it, including dozens of innocent staff members who had nothing to do with the war between Damien and Victor Kane. She did not think. She moved. She crossed the distance between them in 3 quick strides, grabbing his wrist just as his thumb pressed toward the trigger, wrenching his arm upward and away from his body with every ounce of strength she possessed. The device clattered to the floor, skidding across the polished wood, and the man spun toward her with a snarl, his charming mask falling away entirely to reveal something colder, more dangerous underneath. "You should have stayed in the kitchen," he hissed, lunging toward her. Nora sidestepped, years of careful training taking over as fear gave way to instinct, and drove her elbow hard into his ribs, feeling the satisfying crack of impact even as pain shot up her own arm. He staggered but did not fall, grabbing for her hair, for her arms, anything to gain control of the fight. She twisted free, remembering every lesson from that small gym in another life, every hour spent learning how to survive against someone larger and stronger, who believed size alone would win. She was still fighting when Damien rounded the corner, drawn by the commotion, his expression shifting instantly from confusion to fury as he took in the scene, the detonator on the floor, Nora locked in struggle with his newest business contact. He moved fast, faster than she had ever seen him move, closing the distance and driving the man away from her with a force that sent them both crashing against the wall. The fight that followed was brief and brutal, Damien's guards arriving within seconds to overwhelm the intruder entirely, wrestling him to the ground and securing him before he could reach for any other weapon he might have concealed. Damien turned immediately to Nora, his hands finding her shoulders, checking her over with the same fierce urgency he had shown the night of the earlier attack. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, his voice rough with an emotion Nora had never heard from him before. "I'm fine," she said, though her arm throbbed and her breath came ragged. "The device, Damien. It's a detonator. He was going to use it on something in the house." Damien's face went pale as he grasped the full weight of what she was saying. He barked orders to his guards, and within minutes, the entire estate was in careful, controlled motion. Guests quietly ushered toward the exits under false pretenses, guards sweeping the property with methodical urgency, while Damien remained close to Nora, unwilling to let her out of his sight. They found the explosive device nearly an hour later, hidden beneath the floorboards of the wine cellar, close enough to the main hall to have caused catastrophic damage had it been triggered during the dinner. Damien stood staring down at it for a long moment, after the bomb technician confirmed it had been safely disarmed, his jaw tight, his hands clenched at his sides. He would have killed everyone in that room, he said quietly, more to himself than to Nora. My guests, my staff, everyone. But he didn't, Nora said gently, because you got there in time. Because you stopped him, Damien corrected, turning to face her fully. Nora, if you hadn't followed him, hadn't grabbed that detonator when you did, none of us would still be standing here. Nora did not know how to respond to the weight of his gratitude, the raw, unguarded look in his eyes as he studied her, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. She had spent her entire time in this house trying to remain invisible, and yet here she was, standing at the center of everything, having twice now stood between Damien Voss and the danger closing in around him. He reached out slowly, cupping her face gently in his hands, his thumb brushing lightly over the faint bruise still fading along her jaw from the earlier attack. I don't know how I missed it, he said quietly, how I looked at you every day for weeks, and saw nothing but a maid who dropped my folders. Most people do, Nora said softly, though there was no bitterness in her voice now, only a quiet, aching honesty. I've spent a long time learning how to be underestimated. It kept me safe, once. Damien's expression softened further, something protective and fierce blooming behind his eyes. Not anymore, he said. Not in this house. Not with me. The moment stretched between them, charged with everything neither of them had said aloud, the weeks of careful distance finally collapsing under the weight of shared danger and grudging, growing trust. Damien's hand lingered against her cheek a moment longer before he finally stepped back, though something had shifted permanently between them, something neither could pretend away now. Later that night, after the guests had been safely dispersed and the estate secured, Damien sat with Nora in his study, the same room where their strange, complicated relationship had first begun weeks earlier. The captured intruder had been questioned by Gareth's men, revealing under pressure that he had indeed been sent by Victor Kane, part of a larger plan meant to eliminate Damien entirely and seize control of his territory in one devastating strike. He wasn't working alone, Damien said grimly, staring at a photograph Gareth had recovered from the man's belongings, an image of the estate's floor plan marked with careful notes. This kind of detail, the layout of the wine cellar, the timing of tonight's dinner, someone inside this house gave him that information. Nora studied the photograph carefully, something nagging at the edge of her memory. The wine cellar renovation, she said slowly. Only a handful of people had access to those blueprints. Margaret would know exactly who. Damien's eyes sharpened with sudden focus. Get her, he said. Now. As Nora rose to fetch Margaret, she felt the shape of the night's events settling heavily around her, the danger they had narrowly avoided, the traitor still hiding somewhere within these walls, and the strange, undeniable bond that had formed between herself and the man she had once believed saw her as nothing more than clumsy, unremarkable, useless. She understood now that surviving tonight had only bought them time, not safety. Victor Kane would try again, and whoever had betrayed Damien from the inside was still out there, waiting for their next opportunity to strike. Margaret's hands shook as she sat across from Damien in the study, her eyes darting between his cold, controlled expression and Nora standing quietly near the window, the photograph of the estate's blueprints lying flat on the desk between them. I didn't know what they were planning, Margaret said, her voice cracking under the weight of weeks of fear and guilt. Victor's men found my brother 2 months ago. They told me if I didn't share small details, schedules, floor plans, nothing that seemed dangerous at the time, they would hurt him. I never thought it would lead to this. I never thought anyone would try to kill you. Damien's jaw tightened, the betrayal clearly cutting deeper than he wanted to show, but Nora watched something else pass behind his eyes as well, a flicker of understanding rather than pure fury. He had built his empire on strength and control, but even he understood the particular kind of desperation that came from watching someone you loved threatened by forces beyond your control. Where is your brother now? Damien asked, his voice low and measured. They still have him, Margaret whispered. I don't know where. Damien was silent for a long moment, weighing something carefully behind his sharp eyes. Finally, he turned to Gareth, who stood near the door. "Find him," he said simply. "Whatever it takes. And Margaret stays under protection until this is finished. She's not the enemy here. She's a woman who was cornered into an impossible choice." Nora felt a quiet swell of respect for the decision, a fairness she had not expected from a man once described to her as ruthless and unforgiving. Margaret dissolved into tears of relief, murmuring broken apologies, and was led away by one of the household guards to a secured room for her own safety. Once the study emptied, Damien turned to Nora, exhaustion finally cracking through his usual composure. "Victor used her brother as leverage," he said. "That's how he's been getting information all this time. Not malice. Fear. It doesn't make it hurt less," Nora said gently. "But it does tell us something important. Victor doesn't win through strength alone. He wins by finding people's weaknesses and pulling on them until they break." Damien looked at her carefully, something calculating shifting behind his gaze. "Then we need to find his weaknesses too." Over the following 2 days, the estate operated under heightened security. Every entrance monitored, every staff member rescreened, every possible vulnerability sealed as tightly as Damien's men could manage. Gareth's search for Margaret's brother continued quietly in the background, while Damien and Nora worked closely together, piecing apart everything they knew about Victor Kane's operations, his patterns, his people, his ambitions. Nora found herself drawn deeper into Damien's confidence with each passing hour, no longer treated as staff, but as a genuine partner in the unfolding crisis. He valued her observations, her instinct for noticing small details others missed, the same instinct that had twice now saved his life. She began to understand, gradually, that whatever careful walls she had built around herself since arriving at the estate were crumbling in the face of his growing trust, his growing warmth, the quiet way he now sought her opinion before making decisions that once would have been entirely his own. "You keep looking at me like you're trying to solve a puzzle," Nora said one evening, catching him watching her across the study as she reviewed a stack of shipping manifests, searching for any connection to Victor's operations. "Maybe I am," Damien admitted, setting down his pen. "I spent weeks assuming you were exactly what you appeared to be, quiet, unremarkable. I was wrong about almost everything, and I don't like being wrong." "Most people prefer being right," Nora said, a faint smile tugging at her lips, despite the tension still coiled tight in her chest. "I prefer understanding people accurately," Damien said. "It's safer that way, but you've made that difficult." Nora set down the manifest she had been studying, meeting his gaze directly. "I never wanted to be difficult. I wanted to be invisible. It kept me safe, before." "Before what?" Damien asked quietly, and for the first time, Nora found herself wanting to answer honestly. She told him, carefully and without embellishment, about the relationship she had escaped years earlier, about a man who had controlled every part of her life until she found the strength and the training to leave, about the quiet, deliberate choice she had made afterward, to disappear into ordinary, unremarkable work, where no one would ever look closely enough to find her again. Damien listened without interrupting, his expression darkening with something protective, something that looked almost like anger on her behalf. "He doesn't get to define what you're capable of," Damien said finally, his voice low and firm. "Not anymore." Something in Nora's chest loosened at those words, a weight she had carried for years finally easing, if only slightly. She had spent so long believing her strength needed to remain hidden, a secret weapon rather than a visible part of who she was. Sitting here now, in this study, with a man who had witnessed exactly what she was capable of, and respected her more for it, rather than less, she felt something shift permanently inside her. The breakthrough came on the 3rd day, when Gareth's men located the warehouse where Margaret's brother was being held, a rundown building on the edge of the industrial district that also appeared, according to careful surveillance, to be one of Victor Kane's primary operational bases. Damien assembled his most trusted men for a careful extraction, planning to free Margaret's brother while gathering whatever intelligence they could about Victor's larger plans. Nora insisted on being part of the operation, and though Damien resisted at first, arguing the danger was too great, he eventually relented, recognizing that her instincts and quick thinking had proven invaluable at every turn since the danger began. "Stay close to me," he said as they prepared to leave. his hand resting briefly against her arm. "And if anything goes wrong, you run. Do you understand?" "I understand," Nora said, though they both knew, from everything that had happened before, that she was unlikely to run if his life was genuinely at risk. The warehouse operation unfolded with tense, careful precision under cover of darkness. Damien's men moved into position around the building's perimeter, while Damien and Nora approached a side entrance identified as the least guarded point of entry. Inside, the building was dim and quiet, the air thick with the smell of motor oil and old rust, and Nora's senses stayed sharp, cataloging every sound, every shadow, every possible threat as they moved carefully through the narrow corridors. They found Margaret's brother in a small locked room near the back of the warehouse, frightened but unharmed, and Damien's men moved quickly to free him and escort him toward the extraction point. But as they turned to leave, alarms began blaring through the building, and Nora's stomach dropped as the sound of running footsteps echoed from multiple directions at once. "We've been spotted," Damien said grimly, drawing his weapon. "Nora, stay behind me." They fought their way back toward the entrance, Damien's men engaging Victor's guards in tense, controlled confrontations along the way, and Nora found herself once again relying on every instinct and skill she had spent years developing, helping to clear their path, watching Damien's back as fiercely as he watched hers. It was in the final stretch of corridor before the exit that Victor Kane himself appeared, flanked by two of his most trusted men, blocking their path entirely. He was older than Nora expected, silver-haired and composed despite the chaos erupting around him, studying Damien with the calm, calculating gaze of a man who had been planning this confrontation for a very long time. "Damien," Victor said, almost pleasantly, as though greeting an old friend rather than a mortal enemy. "I have to admit, I didn't expect your little maid to cause quite this much trouble." "She's not just a maid," Damien said, his voice hard as steel, positioning himself protectively between Nora and the threat ahead. Victor's eyes shifted to Nora, studying her with new interest. "No," he said slowly, "I suppose she isn't." What followed was a tense standoff, weapons raised on both sides, the fate of everyone in that corridor balanced on a knife's edge. Nora's mind raced, searching for any advantage, any opening, and found it in the small, careful details she had noticed since entering the warehouse: the layout of the room, the position of a loose support beam near Victor's men, the slight limp one of his guards carried from an old injury. She moved before anyone could stop her, throwing herself sideways to grab a length of loose chain hanging from the support beam, swinging it hard against the injured guard's weakened leg, and sending him crashing to the ground in a howl of pain. The distraction was enough. Damien moved instantly, disarming the second guard with brutal efficiency, while his own men surged forward to close the gap. Victor, seeing his advantage collapse in an instant, raised his weapon toward Damien in one final, desperate attempt. But Nora was already moving, throwing herself between them with a speed that left no room for hesitation. The shot rang out, and for one horrifying moment, everything seemed to stop entirely. But Nora had anticipated the angle correctly, twisting at the last possible instant so the bullet grazed harmlessly along the edge of her sleeve rather than finding its mark, and in the chaos of the moment, Damien's men overwhelmed Victor entirely, wrestling him to the ground and securing him before he could fire again. The corridor fell into sudden, ringing silence, broken only by heavy breathing and the distant sound of sirens approaching from beyond the warehouse walls. Damien turned to Nora immediately, his hands gripping her shoulders, his eyes wild with fear and relief in equal measure. "You could have died," he said, his voice raw. "But I didn't," Nora said, breathless but steady, "and neither did you." Damien pulled her against him then, holding her tightly amid the wreckage and chaos of the warehouse, and Nora felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, entirely and completely seen. Victor Kane was handed over to the authorities that same night, along with enough evidence gathered from the warehouse to ensure he would face consequences for years of violence and manipulation. Margaret's brother was reunited with his sister within hours, and the household staff, once tense and fearful, began to breathe easier as word spread that the danger hanging over the estate had finally been dismantled. In the days that followed, the estate settled into a new kind of calm, one built not on fear and rigid control, but on something steadier and more genuine. Damien called a gathering of his household staff in the main hall, an unusual step for a man who rarely addressed his employees directly, and Nora stood among them, uncertain why she had been asked to attend until Damien's eyes found hers across the room. "Many of you have worked in this house for years," Damien began, his voice carrying easily through the quiet hall. "You've seen me make judgments quickly, sometimes too quickly, about who deserves respect and who does not. Recently, I was reminded how wrong those judgments can be." He crossed the room slowly until he stood beside Nora, turning to face the gathered staff with an openness Nora had never witnessed from him before. This woman was underestimated by nearly everyone in this house, myself included, from the very first day she arrived. I called her clumsy. I treated her as though her only value was in staying quiet and out of sight. I was wrong. She has saved my life more than once, protected this household from threats none of the rest of us saw coming, and shown more courage and integrity than most people I have known in my life. Nora felt heat rise to her cheeks under the weight of every eye in the room, but she did not look away, did not shrink from the attention as she once might have. She had spent years believing her strength needed to remain hidden to keep her safe. Standing here now, acknowledged openly by a man who had once dismissed her so easily, she understood that true safety came not from invisibility, but from being valued for exactly who she was. "From this day forward," Damien continued, "Nora will not be working as household staff. She'll be working directly with me, as someone I trust completely." He turned to her then, his expression softening into something private and warm, despite the audience surrounding them. "If she's willing." Nora felt the weight of the moment settle over her, the culmination of everything she had endured and overcome since walking through the estate's iron gates weeks earlier, desperate and uncertain, believing herself unremarkable and easily dismissed. She thought of every moment she had been underestimated, every time her quiet strength had been mistaken for weakness, and felt, for the first time in years, entirely free of that old, familiar burden. "I'm willing," she said simply, and the small, genuine smile that broke across Damien's usually guarded face told her everything she needed to know about the path unfolding ahead of them both. In the weeks that followed, Nora's role within the estate transformed entirely, no longer confined to the shadows of household duty, but standing openly beside Damien as he rebuilt his operations with newfound caution and wisdom learned from the danger they had narrowly survived together. She brought her own instincts and insight to decisions that once would have been his alone, and Damien, in turn, learned to value perspectives he had once dismissed without a second thought. Their partnership deepened into something neither had expected when Nora first arrived, desperate and unremarkable in the eyes of a man too guarded to see past his own assumptions. What grew between them was built not on the fragile foundation of first impressions, but on something far sturdier, tested by fire and danger, and the quiet, steady proof of character, revealed only in moments that truly mattered. Damien Voss had once believed a curvy, quiet maid could offer him nothing of value beyond keeping his floors clean and his shelves dusted. He had learned, in the end, that the very qualities he dismissed so carelessly, her patience, her sharp instincts, her hidden strength, forged through years of quiet survival, were exactly what stood between him and disaster when it mattered most. Nora Bellamy had come to that house, looking only for safety and invisibility. She left behind, instead, every doubt that had ever convinced her she was less than what she truly was, standing at last beside a man who saw her clearly, not as useless, not as unremarkable, but as the equal partner she had always been capable of becoming.